"It's all right," she shouted. "Everything's all right. The magician's a brick, and I've seen him, Aslan." After that she went from them like the wind and out into the garden. Here the garden was shaking with the jumps and air ringing with the shouts of the monopods. Both were redoubled when they caught sight of her. "Here she comes! Here she comes!" they cried. "Three cheers for the little girl! Ah, she put it across the old gentleman properly, she did!" "And we're extremely regrettable," said the monopod, "that we can't give you the pleasure of seeing us as we were before we were uglified. For you wouldn't believe the difference, and that's the truth, for there's no denying we're mortally ugly now, so we won't deceive you." "Eh, that we are, Chief, that we are," echoed the others, bouncing like so many toy balloons. "You said it, you said it." "But I don't think you are at all," said Lucy, shouting to make herself heard. "I think you look very nice." Hear her," said the monopods. "True for you, missy. Very nice we look. You couldn't find a handsomer lot." They said this without any surprise, nor did they seem to notice that they had changed their minds. "She's a sayin'," remarked the chief monopod, "as how we look very nice before we were uglified." "True for you, Chief, true for you," chanted the others. "That's what she says. We heard her ourselves." "I did not," bawled Lucy. "I said you were very nice now." She did," said the chief monopod. "Said we were very nice then." Hear 'em both, said the monopods. "There's a pair for you. Always right. They couldn't have put it better." "But we're saying just the opposite," Lucy said, stamping her foot with impatience. "So you are, to be sure, so you are," said the monopods. "Nothing like an opposite. Keep it up, both of you." "You're enough to drive anyone mad," said Lucy, and gave up. But the monopod seemed perfectly contented, and she decided that on the whole the conversation had been a success. And before everyone went to bed that evening, something else happened which made them even more satisfied with their one-legged condition. Caspian and all the Narnians went back as soon as possible to the shore to give their news to Rince and the others on board the Dwn Trdr, who were by now very anxious. And of course the monopods went with them, bouncing like footballs and agreeing with one another in loud voices, till Eustace said, "I wish the magician would make them inaudible instead of invisible." He was soon very sorry he had spoken, because then he had to explain that an inaudible thing is something that you can't hear, and though he took a lot of trouble, he never felt sure that the monopods had really understood, and what especially annoyed him was that they said in the end, he can't put things the way our chief does, but you'll learn, young man. Hark to him. He'll show you how to say things. There's a speaker for you." And when they reached the bay, Reepicheep had a brilliant idea. He had his little cockerel lowered, and paddled himself about in it till the monopods were thoroughly interested. Then he stood up in it and said, "Worthy, intelligent monopods, you do not need boats. Each of you has a foot that will do instead. Just jump as lightly as you can on the water and see what happens." The chief monopod hung back and warned the others that they'd find the water powerfully wet, but one or two of the younger ones tried it almost at once, and then a few others followed their examples, and at last the whole lot did the same thing. It worked perfectly. The huge single foot of a monopod acted as a natural raft or boat, and when Reepicheep had taught them how to cut rude paddles for themselves, they all paddled about the bay and around the Dwn Trdr, looking for all the world like a fleet of little canoes with fat dwarfs standing up in the extreme stern of each. They had races, and bottles of wine were lowered down to them from the ship as prizes, and the sailors stood leaning over the ship's sides and laughed till their own sides ached. The duffers were also very pleased with their new names of monopods, which seemed to them a magnificent name, though they never got it right. "That's what we are," they bellowed. "Moneypuds, pommymods, pottymons, just what it was on the tip of our tongues to call ourselves." But they soon got it mixed up with their old name of duffers, and finally settled down to calling themselves dufflepuds, and that is what they will probably be called for centuries. That evening all the Narnians dined upstairs with the magician, and Lucy noticed how different the whole top floor looked, and now that she was no longer afraid of it. The mysterious signs in the doors were still mysterious, but they looked as if they had been kind and cheerful meanings, and even the bearded mirror now seemed funny rather than frightening. At dinner everyone had by magic what everyone liked best to eat and drink, and after dinner the magician did a very useful and beautiful piece of magic. He laid two blank sheets of parchment on the table and asked Drinian to give him an exact account of their voyage up to date. And as Drinian spoke, everything he described came out on the parchment in fine, clear lines, till at last each sheet was a splendid map of the Eastern Ocean, showing Galima, Terabithia, the Seven Isles, the Lone Islands, Dragon Island, Burnt Island, Deathwater, and the Land of the Duffers itself, all exactly the right sizes and in the right positions. They were the first maps ever made of those seas, and better than any that had been made since without magic. For on those, though the towns and mountains looked at first like they would on an ordinary map, yet when the magician lent them a magnifying glass, you saw that they were perfect little pictures of the real things, so that you could see the very castle and slave market and streets in Narrowhaven, all very clear, though very distant, like things seen through the wrong end of a telescope. The only drawback was that the coastline of most of the islands was incomplete, for the map showed only what Drinian had seen with his own eyes. When they were finished, the magician kept one himself and presented the other to Caspian. It still hangs in his chamber of instruments at Cair Pavel. But the magician could tell them nothing about the seas or lands further east. He did, however, tell them that about 7 years before a Narnian ship had put in at his waters, and that she had on board the lords of Revlian, Asgod, Marvamorn, and Roop. So they judged that the golden man they had seen lying in Deathwater must be Lord Restamar. Next day the magician magically mended the stern of the Dwn Trdr where it had been damaged by the sea serpent, and loaded her with useful gifts. There was a most friendly parting, and when she sailed 2 hours after noon, all the Dufflepuds paddled out with her to the harbour mouth, and cheered until she was out of the sound of their cheering.